Bullies mock elderly woman at cafe only to discover she's Keanu Reeves' mother. Their reaction is priceless. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. It was supposed to be just another quiet afternoon at a small cafe in Los Angeles. But within minutes everything changed. Loudly, painfully, and dramatically. The year was 2022. Tucked into the corner of Sunset Diner, an elderly woman sat quietly, sipping on black coffee. Her silver hair was neatly pulled back into a bun, and she wore a soft wool sweater that had clearly seen better days. She looked out the window as if lost in thought, a worn leather journal resting by her hand. Across the room, three young men, college-aged, loud and clearly full of themselves, sat slouched in their booth. It started small. One of them nudged the other, point in her direction, a snicker. Then louder laughter. "Hey grandma, writing love letters to your cat," one of them called out, loud enough for the whole cafe to hear. The woman didn't flinch. She simply turned the page in her journal and continued writing. "Bet she lives alone." Another added, "Look at that sweater. Probably older than she is." The cafe fell into an uncomfortable silence. A barista behind the counter glanced nervously at the woman, unsure whether to intervene. But the woman remained calm, stirring her coffee gently, and then the door chimed. In walked a man, tall, dark hair tucked into a beanie, wearing a plain black t-shirt and jeans. His head was down, scrolling through his phone. As he approached the counter, he barely looked around, but when the barista greeted him by name, the entire room froze. "Wait, is that one of the young men?" whispered, as if essing the shift. The elderly woman finally glanced up just as the man turned and met her eyes. His face instantly softened. "Mom." Keanu Reeves' voice carried across the room, filled with warmth and disbelief. The bully jaws dropped. One of them accidentally knocked over his drink, scrambling to clean it up, but his eyes never left the actor. Keanu walked straight to her table, kneeling beside her chair as if they were the only two people in the world. "I didn't know you were in town," he said softly, taking her hand in his. She smiled, brushing a stray hair from his forehead like mothers do, even when their children are grown. "I wanted to surprise you." The room seemed to hold its breath. The bullies sat frozen in place, exchanging panicked glances, and that was just the beginning. Keanu stayed kneeling by her chair, holding her hand as if it were the most precious thing in the world. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, gently tracing the delicate lines of age. There was something unspoken in his eyes, something only a son who'd nearly lost his mother could understand. The young men shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, but none of them dared to leave. It felt wrong, like walking out of a sacred moment. Keanu's mother, Patricia, pushed his hair back the way she used to when he was a boy. "I wanted to see you," she said softly. "I missed you. I missed you too," he replied, his voice quiet. "You should have told me you were coming." She laughed gently, the sound small and tired. "And let you fuss over me. I didn't want to be a bother." He smiled, but there was something in his eyes that looked like it hurt to hear that. "Mom, you could never be a bother." The cafe seemed smaller now, quieter. One of the bees started wiping down an already clean counter just to have something to do. The bullies, who had laughed at Patricia, now sat stiff and silent, their faces pale. After a long pause, Keanu spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "Is everything okay?" Patricia hesitated for a fraction of a second, too brief for most to notice. But not her son. He saw it. Keanu leaned closer, his hands still wrapped around hers. "I'm fine," she said, but she wasn't. He studied her for a moment before nodding slightly. "We'll talk about it later," he said softly, as if he already knew the truth she wasn't ready to share. Patricia smiled in the way mothers do when they're holding something back but want to protect their child. "Let me take you home," Keanu said. Rising to his feet, he helped her out of her chair, steadying her with both hands as if she were made of glass. The cafe watched as Keanu tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, guiding her gently toward the door. But just before they left, he stopped. Keanu glanced over his shoulder, locking eyes with the three young men who now sat frozen, their heads down like school boys caught causing trouble. His gaze wasn't angry, just quiet, calm, and unshakably disappointed. "You never know who someone is," Keanu said simply, his voice soft but cutting through the silence like a knife. "Or who they matter to." The door chimed Again and then they were gone the three. Bullies sat in silence long after their drinks had gone cold. The streets outside were quiet as Keanu walked slowly, his arms still wrapped gently around Patricia's. The sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Neither of them spoke for a while, content to just be in each other's presence. After a few blocks, Patricia tugged softly on his arm, guiding him toward a bench under a large oak tree. Keanu didn't question it. He helped her sit down and took a seat beside her, their shoulders touching lightly. "I'm proud of you, you know," Patricia said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at him with the same eyes that had watched over him as a child, the same eyes that had held both joy and sorrow through the years. Keanu smiled faintly, but his gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "You've told me that before, Mom." She reached over, covering his hand with hers. "I need to say it more." There was a weight to her words that made Keanu finally look at her. His mother was strong, always had been, but now in the golden glow of the setting sun she looked fragile in a way that broke his heart. "You don't have to, Mom," he said softly. "I know." Patricia looked down at their joined hands, her thumb tracing the lines of his palm. "I think about your sister a lot," she said, her voice trembling just enough for him to notice. Keanu's throat tightened. He nodded slowly. "I do too." They sat in silence, the memory of Kim lingering between them like a ghost. His sister had been gone for years, but grief had a strange way of lingering, quiet and persistent, like an old wound that never fully healed. Patricia exhaled softly, the sound almost lost in the rustle of leaves above them. "I guess I'm just scared, Keanu. I don't want to leave you alone." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers with quiet desperation. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly, as if saying it out loud could somehow make it true. Patricia smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I used to say that to you when you were little, when you'd have nightmares." "I remember," Keanu replied, "and you were always right." She squeezed his hand a little tighter. "I just want you to know, if anything ever happens, you've made my life so full, watching you grow into the man you were. It's been the greatest gift I could have ever asked for." Keanu's eyes burned, but he blinked hard, holding it back. "Mom." Before he could finish, Patricia leaned over and kissed his forehead, her lips lingering for just a moment longer than usual. "Lead go home," she said softly, standing with his help as they walked back to his car. Keanu's arms stayed firmly around her. Each step felt heavier, as if he were trying to hold on to the moment, trying to keep time from moving forward. And somewhere deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, this evening was one he'd remember for the rest of his life. They drove in silence, the soft hum of the engine the only sound between them. Patricia rested her head lightly against the window, watching the city lights flicker past. Keanu glanced over at her every so often just to make sure she was still there, still breathing, still his. It felt like when he was a kid driving home late at night from his little league games. Patricia always drove, and he'd sit quietly in the back watching her reflection in the rear view mirror. Even then there was something safe about her presence, like nothing bad could happen as long as she was near. Now the roles were reversed, and he found himself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, afraid that if he let go she might disappear. "Do you remember that cabin we used to go to in Canada?" Patricia's voice broke the quiet. She wasn't looking at him, still gazing out at the streets that seemed to blur together. Keanu smiled faintly. "The one by the lake? Yeah, I remember. You used to make pancakes every morning." She chuckled softly, the sound warm and familiar. "You and Kim would fight over who got the first batch, always burnt, but you both swore they tasted better that way." "They did," Keanu said, glancing at her with a soft smile, "because you made them." Patricia's eyes glistened, but she quickly blinked it away. "I miss those days. Everything felt simpler." Keanu nodded, feeling the ache in her words. "Yeah, me too." They pulled up to his house and he parked slowly, letting the engine idle for a moment. Neither of them moved to get out. The house sat quietly in front of them, its windows glowing faint from the porch light. Patricia sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the years between them. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "maybe we should go back there one last time." Keanu turned to her, searching her face for some hint of why she suddenly wanted this. "We can, Mom, whenever you want." Her hand rested gently on his arm, her Grip light but steady. I just don't want to leave without saying goodbye to the places that mattered. His heart twisted. Painfully. You're not leaving. Patricia smiled gently, brushing a strand of his hair back like she had done 1,000 times before. Not yet, she whispered. They sat there for a long time, the car slowly cooling around them. Finally Keanu exhaled softly and opened his door. Come on, let's get you inside. He helped her out of the car and Patricia leaned against him as they made their way up the steps. Her hand slipped into his, and for a fleeting moment it felt just like when he was a boy, small and safe beside his mother. But this time he held her hand a little tighter, as if trying to shield her from the very thing he knew he couldn't stop. Keanu guided Patricia inside, and the warm glow of the house wrapped around them like a familiar blanket. The soft click of the door behind them echoed in the quiet. He helped her slip off her coat, hanging it carefully by the door as if it might crumble if handled too roughly. Sit down, Mom, I'll make you some tea, Keanu said softly, already heading toward the kitchen. Patricia smiled faintly and lowered herself onto the couch, her fingers grazing the edge of the blanket draped over the armrest. She pulled it over her lap, tracing the pattern as if it held memories stitched into the fabric. Keanu moved quietly in the kitchen, the faint clink of mugs and the hum of the kettle filling the space. He glanced through the doorway, watching her for a moment as she sat in the soft lamplight, her head resting back against the cushion. It struck him how small she looked. She used to be the strongest person he knew, the one who held their little family together when everything else was falling apart. Now the weight of time seemed to rest heavily on her shoulders. The kettle whistled softly and Keanu poured the tea, carrying it carefully back to the living room. He set the cup in front of her, then sat down beside her, his arm resting along the back of the couch. Thank you, Patricia said, lifting the cup with both hands. The steam curled around her face, softening the lines that had appeared over the years. Keanu watched her, the silence stretching between them. Finally he spoke. Mom, what aren't you telling me? His voice was gentle, but there was an unmistakable tremble underneath. Patricia paused, the cup halfway to her lips, her eyes lowered for a moment, and when she looked at him, there was no hiding the sadness there. I went to the doctor last week, she said, quietly placing the tea back down on the table. She folded her hands in her lap as if bracing herself. Keanu's heart sank. His throat tightened but didn't speak. They found something, she continued, her voice steady but soft. It's not good, Keanu. He stared at her, unable to breathe for a moment. How bad, he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Patricia reached over, placing her hand on his knee. I don't want you to worry about that right now, she said gently. I'm still here and I plan to be for as long as I can. Keanu's eyes burned, but he forced the tears back. Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner? She smiled softly, her thumb brushing over the fabric of his jeans. Because I know you, Keanu. You carry too much already. I didn't want to add to it. His jaw tightened and he looked away for a moment, trying to gather himself, but the weight in his chest only grew heavier. You're not a burden, he whispered, finally, his voice cracking under the strain. You never could be. Patricia squeezed his hand gently. I know, sweetheart, but I need you to promise me something. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. When the time comes, she said softly, you let me go. Keanu shook his head almost immediately. Don't, I'm serious, Keanu, she interrupted, her voice tender but firm. You've lost so much already. I don't want you to hold on to me in a way that keeps you from living. The tears he had been holding back finally slipped free, trailing silently down his face. Patricia brushed them away with the back of her hand, just as she had done when he was a boy. I can't promise that, Keanu whispered. Patricia smiled gently, leaning her head against his shoulder. That's okay, she said softly. Just love me while I'm here, that's all I need. Keane wrapped his arm around her, holding her tightly as if he could keep the world at bay for just a little longer. And in that quiet living room, under the soft glow of the lamp, they stayed like that, mother and son, wrapped in the fragile, fleeting warmth of a moment they both knew would